Welcome to the Edge of NFT podcast with your hosts, Jeff Kelly, Ethan Janney, and Josh Kriger. We aim to bring you not only the top 1% of what's going on with NFTs today, but what will stand the test of time. We explore the nuts and bolts and the business side, but also the human element of how NFTs are changing the way we interact with the things that we love. This podcast is for the futurists and dreamers, the disruptors and creators, the fans and connectors, and the makers and doers that are pumped about this ecosystem and driving where it goes next.
I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Josh Kriger. I'm one of the three co-hosts of Edge of NFT. We are a podcast that took off a few months ago into the utter limits of what's possible with NFTs. And we have leaders in the space on our show. As a little gift to everyone in the audience, if you check out our most recent show with Animoca that was posted yesterday, the reason I'm wearing race cars is we're doing a race car giveaway, so you can snag your Animoca limited edition Edge of NFT race car. And if you haven't got an NFT, this is a great way to get into the mix. It costs you nothing, and you can race globally for over $150,000 in prizes at the end of or in the middle of this month.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having us. Obviously, my name's Andrew Bull. I'm the founding partner of Bull Blockchain Law. We're a law firm based in the United States, specifically focused on blockchain and cryptocurrency. I started on the technology side, ran an investment company and a mining operation dating back to 2012, 2013. So weighing in on the legal issues for sure.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Majewski. I'm legal advisor at my own practice, Guy Majewski Legal. I'm based in Europe, also dealing with cryptocurrency, crypto assets, all legal matters related to crypto, related to tech sectors. So I'm just practicing in crypto from 2017 and really excited of all this stuff because everything is really complicated, and most is complicated is the most interesting.
Sure. I'm Alexandra Damsker. I'm a corporate and securities attorney. I used to be with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. I headed a practice, had my own practice, started two companies, exited, moved into blockchain in 2016, actually to start a company. The technology wasn't there yet, but in the process ended up sort of becoming an advisor to a bunch of companies and to some high net worth individuals.
All right, so we're going to start with a quick disclaimer. As always, the information is general in nature and not intended to be legal, tax, financial, or investment advice. Please do contact a local professional in your area regarding any specific facts and circumstances. So to kick things off, disruptive technology, as we talked about, does create a lot of gray, but not everything is cloudy. There is hope. There are some things that are black and white. Alexandra, can you talk to us a little bit about what basics of IP and copyright law poured over to the world of NFTs and, help folks understand not everything is complicated as you get into these different areas?
I don't know if I can say everything is not complicated. And I think that James actually covered a lot of the IP issues in his talk. So I'm only going to add that so the big main issues are typically you don't get the digital rights if you own a physical object. You actually have to have that agreed to in advance. So if you are a musician and you got into the business more than 10 years ago, you very likely signed away your digital rights, which is one of the reasons why we see Spotify paying on average $200 to the performers on there, because they pay the rights holders. They don't pay the performers per se. You have to hold the rights. So make sure that you know what rights you have. There's an act called VARA, VARA, which is it's for physical art, and it describes some very specific areas and uses. If you have fewer than 200 copies, then you have a defined moral right to things like, commercial use and things like that. So be very clear. The one thing that I would say that's constant in terms of any intellectual property issue is clarify what exactly you're offering, because we have the basic terminology of purchase and sale, and that really isn't what's happening. And there isn't really room in the law for this concept of buying something but retaining a right. Someone, you can't sell your rights and then retain this right of royalty. It's really, which I believe James said, is what most people want is a limited private license. They want someone to have the ability to look at or listen to their product, but they don't want the ability to have it played commercially. You can't put it in a commercial, for example, without getting some additional consideration or money, right, for the actual creator. What creators usually want is for someone to just have the ability to enjoy it in their home privately, not making money off of it. But that is not necessarily what the people on the other end of the transaction are thinking. So often what they think is, I have it, it's mine, I get to do what I want with it. And that includes, like, I can destroy it, I could burn it, whatever. And that's not necessarily true, particularly under something like Vera, where you can't actually destroy your art without the creator's prior approval. So the biggest problem that I find is not even transferring the rights per se, or these issues of making sure royalties get passed back and stuff. The really big issue is there is not enough clarity on the platforms regarding whether, like, what rights are being transferred and what happens if you exceed those rights. Like, what does that look like and what's the penalty? So
no, appreciate that.
Real quickly. Yeah. So I think that's critical. I mean, and that's why the license I mentioned is so important, because a license is typically going to say what you can do and what you can't do. And generally, if these are copyrighted works and you exceed the scope of the license, it's infringement. And that's, that's going to be the result of what happens. And so it's critical, if you're the IP owner, is to be absolutely clear what you can do. And generally, as Alexandra said, most of the licenses are granting a personal, non-commercial right to use and display the asset associated with the NFT. There are some models, though, that vary from that. So, like, typically that means you get a right to that one instance of the copy of the digital asset. You can't make t-shirts based on that typically. There are some licenses, like Dapper has enabled people to sell a certain amount of commercial product a year. So it doesn't have to be one way or the other. It just has to be clear as to what's permitted and what's not.
Thanks. Appreciate that clarification, James. So I got a question for Andrew. What do you see as the issues regarding NFTs? If you could elaborate on this discussion, how can they be resolved, if they can?
Yeah, for sure. So building off of both what Alexandra and James said, just coming at it from a practitioner perspective, I think one of the largest disconnects is really the actual decision makers in regards to what their educational level is in regards to the legal backdrop as well as the implementation of the technology. So I take two examples, like I'm in a case in federal court, I'm in a case in arbitration. Who is actually ultimately the decision maker around whether the rights are assigned to somebody versus the other? Well, what's the process for educating those individuals on the actual information that we're kind of covering today? And kind of acknowledging that our audience maybe has a little bit of a beginner slant in regards to their education, that transcends to disconnect between consumers and providers, like Alexandra was highlighting. So, and that's also representative in the Dapper Labs lawsuit that's going on as well. I mean, you have a bunch of consumers that are basically claiming that they didn't have enough information to make an educated decision about what it is that they were buying. And so ultimately, I think that while all these legal issues are specifically very, very important, ultimately the people who are going to be making these decisions and setting legal precedent are also ones that need to get information around not only the legal backdrop, but also how to potentially implement that legal framework into this new technology. And so, I mean, that's a generic kind of problem within blockchain in general, but also I think specifically here, where especially with regulatory agencies in the United States, as well as the UK with the FCA and SEC, not necessarily having the bandwidth to go out and provide a significant amount of clarity around something such as NFTs. And so that's another kind of concern as well, is that there's that disconnect from the ability of regulators to provide clarity that the decision makers could ultimately rely on to make decisions about. And so it's really about solving that educational hurdle, not only on the consumer side, but also on the decision-making side.
Right on. So just to make things a little bit more interesting, we now live in a world of metaverses where it's not the physical world, it's not the digital world, it's somewhere in between. So there's questions in my mind around jurisdiction, where these metaverses were created and how that impacts the sales of NFTs within those environments. And then also more specifically, how do sales in metaverses and cross-chain platforms impact creators, particularly with ongoing royalties? Guy, can you kick off this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about NFTs in general, it's we go into some extremely unclear way. And as soon as we apply NFTs and apply it to metaverses, things becomes really unknown. So here, first, metaverse. What would be your jurisdictional approach so far? So, for example, user from Europe goes to metaverse operated by a company from United States. So he's a consumer generally. So, and what jurisdiction it will be applied? Generally to be United States, because it will be written in terms of service. So in general, when we talk about metaverse, everything goes to its terms of service, terms of use, because everything interesting will be provided there. For example, you can create something in the metaverse, create some physical, virtual object like virtual house, or for example, you can create your avatar or some parts of your avatar. And it even doesn't mean that you will own it. You can just say that you own it, but if you take a look at terms of service, it will be written that everything belongs to the operator of this metaverse, and you just have some limited license as well as the creators. Or it can, for example, provide your ownership in your, for example, avatar or some creation, but you will you will be obliged to provide license to operator. So generally here it can be several approaches. For example, if you purchase some item in metaverse, so it doesn't mean that it will be yours. It will the same as aspect that Alexandra covers. So you'll have limited license. You'll have limited license to apply some graphic representation of a source code or object code that governs this metaverse. And the most interesting things go when, for example, several metaverses would like to have some points of exchanges. For example, you can create a car in one metaverse and you would like to drive this car to the second metaverse. So here it's the nature of agreement also, as it was previously covered. So here we need to have two combinations. First, it should be some kind of even three combinations. First, it should be agreement between two operators on metaverses. Secondly, it should be technical integration. And third, it should be integration on the level of terms of service. For example, one metaverse operator can prohibit some items, some specific, just either in the nature of its business, or it would like to follow more strict rules. For example, if it goes, for example, in Arabic countries, or it has some more strict limitation for morality or something like that. So it can just prohibit to put some object from one metaverse to the other metaverse. So here, as everything goes really complicated, because currently, even in license agreements, when you provide license for an object or you create NFT and follow some terms of service, you will see some point that you have the right to use it not like in real world, but also in metaverses. You can present it in metaverse, in museums created in metaverses. You can present it without some limitation, or with some limitation metaverses. So even licensing rights for metaverses is less strict than for real world, because I think that currently people doesn't see real threats in metaverses. However, it's the same life, it's the same rules apply there. And also, for example, when we talk about jurisdiction, so usually, for example, Europeans can enjoy a European jurisdiction notwithstanding of jurisdiction of operated due to consumer protection laws. The same for United States. You can go to US courts to sue a European company. The same. So here, generally, it can be some discussion. What, for example, when intellectual property law will apply, for example, United States, Europe, United Kingdom. So, and there can be different rules. Some can protect intellectual property object from the moment of creation. Some will require some definite tangible form. Some will be okay with just the tangible form is graphic representation it in metaverse that underlined afterwards in some lines of code. So it's really complicated issue. It's really challenging. I like this issue because as much as it's challenging, it's more, as I said, it's more interesting to deal with.
Well, it's also some job security, right? Alexandra, can you talk us through maybe some of the ongoing royalty components of sort of products that are created in the metaverse?
So this is actually a very interesting issue, and I love the whole concept of metaverses. I think it's going to be, I mean, when we talk about the future of NFTs, which is like my favorite topic, one of the really cool things is going to be this outsourced prototyping that you can do through the metaverse. But we have a couple of main problems. The first one I talked about before, which is what happens when you have a royalty agreement and then an owner, you're not the one that puts it in the metaverse. Like you have an artwork, an art piece, and somebody has a museum, right? You're not the person that puts it in an art gallery or a museum that you can purchase from. Then that person, can they display it? It depends. Are they making money on it? Is that something that you already agreed to? Is there a presumption of commercial use or not? So those are all questions that haven't really been resolved. And again, that's kind of what I try to do in these agreements that I attach, so that it's very clear what rights are attached. And you could do a variety of rights. I do wish that the platforms like, Nifty Gateway, OpenSea, et cetera, did a much better job of explaining rights. I mean, I wish they did a lot of things differently, but I wish they did a much better job of describing like the types of rights that you would have and explaining, this one is offering this particular type of right, click on here, and then, you can get that license. I imagine in the next 2 or 3 iterations of any of these platforms and future platforms that will be resolved. The other problem that we're having though is people are looking into collaborations. It's like lots of them are happening. What happens if one party puts something on there on a metaverse and the other party doesn't agree? What happens if 2 people in a metaverse collaborate and they decide to create something new there? Who owns that IP? Who gets any profits from whatever's happening? And the profits are real. There's a guy who paid $250K to do a racehorse on Decentraland. And, like Formula One came out with those cars that you can get. So people pay him rent to race around his track. That's actual money that's happening. There's like this Satoshi's tea house that's also happening. Now, all of those issues are aside from some issues like Superworld. Superworld took the real world and rented off space in it. And the places that exist in the real world aren't particularly thrilled with their name, which they own, being used and purchased in another place without any authority.
Well, Upland as well, right? I mean, Upland as well has
there's a whole group of them came out and they had this brilliant idea of like you could rent, like the first floor of the Empire State Building. Here you go, and we'll make money from it. Like like real places in this theoretical universe, and the Empire State Building is saying, well, that's not okay. So there are some lawsuits pending. I imagine a lot of it will settle because most of the people who are doing this have no money. But what they'll probably end up having to do is either pay for licenses or they'll have to shut it down and reimagine this. And so,
but Super World is just the underlying land. It's not the physical assets on the land. But there's still concerns there. Is what you're saying?
Yeah. Because they're still using the name. There's still, there are people who actually own it's because of the tie to the physical world, where real people own real rights, including the digital rights to those things. That is one of the problems.
I'm kind of bummed because I bought up a lot of the land in Super World where the In-N-Out burgers were located. So I think I have to rethink my metaverse strategy here.
It's very likely, I don't know. I mean, I'm just speculating, but I think very likely they'll come up with some solution. But I think what's happening is there are people who are now starting to get scared off and say, well, I'm not really interested in getting involved. Like, I was just trying to sell smart, man. So, they're not really going to go and look into anything that has this tinge of legal issue that is like what they consider a real legal issue. Weirdly,
I should disclose, since we're having this conversation about Super World, they are one of our sponsors of Edge of NFT, so I can't participate in an unbiased conversation on Super World.
Let me add one thing on that. So it's interesting. So there have been other, going back even before blockchain in virtual worlds, has been different cases that have arisen that are parallel to some of the issues that are going on right now. But one of the ones that was interesting, there was a case against, there was someone who used like a virtual billboard on an actual building, and the building owner sued back then, and the court found that there was no cognizable IP claim that the building owner had because they didn't have billboards. It wasn't like they were losing any advertising or anything. So I think this is a really fascinating question. I think we see with metaverses a lot of interesting legal issues. And if you look back at like Second Life had a number of lawsuits against them. Some of those issues will parallel what's happening right now. But I think there really is a lack of clarity, but people are pushing the envelope. There's lawsuits, and hopefully we'll get some more clarity as some of these get resolved.
Yeah, it sounds like we could have a whole session just on this topic.
For sure, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit.
Generally, interesting things will start when, for example, you have a virtual museum for NFTs in virtual world, for example, metaverse. You start selling tickets to this museum. So it can be also interesting case when you receive some lawsuits from creators. Or, for example, you put no trespassing sign on your property and look at what will happen, for example. So it's really, really challenging will be.
I want to audit the first law school class on metaverses. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Probably a whole semester worth of content there. So I know there's a topic of DAOs coming up, but let's just talk about them for a moment. Specifically, how do DAOs open up new possibilities and create new legal challenges? Andrew, can you kick us off here?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it goes back to the general conversation about who owns what. And specifically, when you implement DAOs, it obviously makes it a little bit more complex in who is actually making decisions around how to either facilitate the transfer of ownership or to sell directly. And so going back to our conversation about platforms like, say, OpenSea, could you envision the ability of the collective user base of OpenSea to be able to actually make decisions about the organizational structure of the entity as well as the operational, basically, outcome of the entity itself? And so that really obviously creates a significant benefit in that it's transferring the right of decision making away from the centralized group of individuals that might be held responsible in the issues that we've kind of highlighted before. However, at the same time, it could also mask an ability of certain groups who might have more decision-making authority in a DAO to be able to make sure that they're remaining anonymous. And so you can envision that same OpenSea example where the voting rights of the user base is tied to something specific, such as how many NFTs you own. Okay, well, now there's an incentive for somebody to go in and purchase a significant amount and then have a larger voting power compared to a lot of the other users. And also tracking them down and figuring out who they are is a potential issue as well. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a movement even within the DAO community where DAOs are popping up every day right now to make sure that community, privileges and voting rights are not necessarily tied to acquisition of tokens or NFTs, but more so contribution to the community. And I'd like to see that continue to be the focus, because essentially the whole purpose of a DAO is a collective ownership based on sort of the spirit of true community and egalitarianism, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that really goes back to the coded rules that are set in the beginning as well. So we need to make sure that developers are implementing that code that allows for the protection and equal distribution of decision making. Because ultimately, the DAO in of itself, it could potentially run rampant in that context, and we've definitely seen that, and that's why the industry is obviously kind of reverting and trying to find a solution there.
Totally. James, anything to add here?
Yeah, two things real quick. One is, I think what's interesting is the point you raised about trying to have kind of relatively equal voting power. I mean, some of these DAOs permit like delegation of votes, and so even if rights are distributed equally, you can still have a concentration of power if there's delegation. And the other thing is, I think Andrew may have touched on this a little bit, but just to put a finer point on it, is that while control may dictate who has liability, with respect to voting and other actions, a number of the U.S. agencies, including SECs, CFTC, and FinCEN, have come out and said basically, if you deploy code, you can be responsible for the foreseeable consequences. So there was at least one action where the SEC went after someone who had a distributed marketplace, and it was facilitating the sale of tokens that were securities, and that individual was charged with the sale of securities, even though they are operating a securities marketplace without complying with SEC regulations. Even though the alleged he didn't have any existing, further control over it. So if you're putting code out there, you may be responsible depending on the facts and circumstances.
Yep, that makes sense. So, I think just kind of going on this topic of responsibilities, we've talked about the metaverses, we've talked about DAOs. I think we should talk about central exchanges and how they fit into this. Binance seems to be in the news every day. They're having a lot of challenges. We've got players like Coinbase in the US that dominate the market. What can we anticipate in terms of their role when it comes to NFTs? Guy, what are your thoughts there?
So here, it would not be a very big difference from general exchanges. So the same regulatory rules will apply, for example. So we have usually two lines of regulation. First, it's like some specific crypto regulation, just covering specific crypto business, and secondly, it's anti-money laundering regulation. For example, if we talk for Europe, currently European law at this moment doesn't know what is NFT. So there is crypto virtual currency that it's not like virtual asset, not crypto asset. It's like covering classic virtual currency. So generally, NFT will not fall in this category. So and all ML regulation, for example, for centralized exchange on the general European general level, for example, it's crypto to crypto, crypto to fiat. Major countries implemented crypto to fiat. Major countries implemented crypto to crypto, and custodian wallet provider. So generally, there is no place for NFTs. And at the moment, Europe does not have any specific crypto regulation. It will go. It's expected that it will be enforced in 2024. It will be direct regulation, and it should cover NFT according to current draft, but it will not be really restrictive. It will not be really painful. It just be will provide regulatory requirements the same as for financial markets. But it's like the current draft. For example, United Kingdom have more broader regulation, broader definition of crypto asset, and they should be tradable, transferable. And in this case, NFT can easily go under regulation. And in this case, ML law, for example, of United Kingdom will require registration of this exchange. If you provide some exchange or facilitate trades, you need to register per conduct a business. And here in the United Kingdom, currently it will be trouble. They have big line, big queue for registration. So something like that. So no big difference, just the nature of asset. And also it can be some also issue, but I think it will be most connected to United States when platform can be also money transmitter. If you send crypto as a payment from one user to the other user, if it will be either decentralized or centralized. However, it's like FinCEN, it's up to FinCEN regulations, and they do not have some like definite requirements. So it will be case to case basis, because it can be either hosted, unhosted, and so on.
So do any of our other panelists have anything to add there in sort of in terms of centralized and decentralized exchanges and NFTs?
The one thing I think is probably, I'm sorry, did somebody else going to say something? Or?
No, go for it.
The one thing I want to just mention regarding centralized exchanges right now, there's a law or a bill that's on well, not even a bill, it's like a regulation that's kind of on the table, which I thought was going to go away because it was proposed at the very end of the Trump administration by an acting director. And usually the presumption is if you're a director, then you keep everything except the ones you specifically toss. But for acting directors, because they didn't really have the power of the office, they toss everything except for stuff that they pose again to keep. But this one is the counterparty data rule. I don't know if you guys have heard of this one, but this is Andrew has. So it's not great. It's a rule basically that means that exchanges are going to have to know both sides of a transaction. So not only is that an issue regarding anonymity, it is also going to be an issue regarding unhosted wallets and things like that. And so as NFTs move into DeFi, which is a future use of them, they're just an asset-backed token that can be used in DeFi as DeFi expands. One of the issues is staking is going to be severely limited if this passes and doesn't have an exception, which it doesn't currently have for unhosted wallets. So so this will be, this can limit the future uses with respect to NFTs in terms of their ability to be used for finance, but also just has a lot broader implications in general. Thank
you. So we have a few more questions, and we got some great questions from the audience I want to get to as well. The pink elephant in the room and all these conversations around NFTs and tokens is the Howie Test. And I want to talk about that in terms of what when it comes to NFTs, what makes them a security versus not a security. In particular, recognizing the case law here varies country to country. What are the landmines to try to avoid if you want to create NFTs, but you don't want to get into the world of securities? And let's start this off with Alexandra again.
So pink elephant, right? Pink's a power color. That's good. Okay, so first of all, I just want to point out that the Howie Test regards investment contracts. That is one particular type of security that is that can be regulated under the securities rules. So when people think that they have, cleared, as much as you can say that, the Howie Test, that does not mean that there is no other way it could possibly be a security. So I just want to make that clear that everybody who's living and dying on Howie, which by the way has a lot of case law that just trying to summarize where it is and where it's going, isn't as useful as looking at current interpretations that the SEC has already provided in analysis and things like no action letters and other things, just because that's going to give you a sense of the current view, because sometimes things change, right? Or in practice, the application of a particular principle that has come out in some law like Howie, some principle that's come out like Howie, it's been circumscribed by act or by interpretation, regulation, or just practice. So that aside, right? Howie says that, you can't transfer for value. If you purchase something for value in, and you're purchasing as a third party and it is for investment purposes, then it's a security under this very small aspect of investment contracts. It's from an Orange Grove case. And essentially what it means is if you're investing in something and you're not planning on actually doing any of the operations, then, and you're in it and it's speculative, and the only reason you're in it is because you believe it will increase in value, then it's very likely a security. So I think, honestly, the last director of CorpFin actually kind of described this in a much better way, which is the big problem during the ICOs, the initial coin offerings of 2016-17. There was so much wrong with them. SAFs are not a thing. Why did they become a thing? They're not a thing, but they were not useful. They were illegal. So I don't really know how that happened, but I actually do know how that happened. But so here's what he said. He said that if you're basically selling a membership to a club, like a book club, that is not a security. If you're like the book club exists and it meets and whatever, then that's not a security. If you're selling a membership to a book club and the club doesn't exist and the books aren't even published and the library hasn't been built yet, then it's very likely a security. So here it's basically the levels of speculative investment that you're looking at. So this is why the tokens that have utility but are put on a marketplace generally are considered securities, because there's no utility at the time. Having a roadmap or a white paper is not utility. It's an intention of utility, but that doesn't mean it's actual utility. So there's like a big distinction between things that you invest in that you're hoping are going to gain additional value versus things that you're investing in because you want to be a part of it. So it even matters who's doing it. If you're buying tokens for something because you're a dev and you want to be able to work on that app, that's not necessarily a security then, right? Even if it's the same token, because that person's doing something. Now, what if it's a DAO and you're like, there are now NFT groups that are trying to form DAOs that are trying to issue NFTs on the collective work of the group. But and the issue is, well, are all the people who are not involved in the DAO, who are involved in the DAO but are not involved in that particular issuance, is any membership in that DAO, is that considered a security? And like, if I get a token for that DAO and then sell the token on the marketplace, did I commit a securities transaction? And all of that is very murky because we don't yet know what DAO responsibility is, right? Like I'm in Shapeshift, is one of the many exchanges that I use. Shapeshift is now transitioning into a DAO. And I get, lucky me, right? I get these token drops periodically, like they're airdrops of Fox tokens, right? Because they're saying everybody's going to be part of it. Does that mean that I'm an active member of the DAO that is going to be and is in some way is controlling Shapeshift? Like, as you decentralize, does that mean that something that was clearly a security before has now morphed into something that's not a security because I'm a de facto appointed member of a DAO? Like, I didn't choose anything, I don't do anything, I collect money, right? So that's not, there's a lot of gray area going on. And I think that DAO discussion that just happened is helpful in considering stuff like that. But the after this very long answer, really it's, you have to talk to a securities attorney. And if we can look at XRP, maybe we're not supposed to mention that, but they got apparently like 13 opinions, and 12 of them were ones they didn't like. The 13th one they used. So if you're getting a crap ton of opinions that you don't like, please don't keep shopping for lawyers. Consider that some actual advice that you paid for, and consider acting on it accordingly. There is nothing wrong with registering with the SEC. So, okay, all of that aside. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say is there are people out there that are selling jurisdiction. Don't do that. Don't do that. You don't need to buy jurisdiction. But I don't know if you guys have seen that. Someone just sent me an email about that. Don't buy jurisdiction. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Can I add something to that, Josh? So two things real quick. I think that was great, Alexandra. There's a lot there. A couple on that last point. Yeah, we see this all the time. People are like, well, if I set up in Isle of Man or Jersey or some crypto friendly jurisdiction, do I avoid U.S. laws? The answer is no. If you're selling to U.S. residents, U.S. law is going to apply to you for at least those transactions. The other thing I think that's very confusing in this space with NFTs, and Alexandra touched on this, but I just to kind of amplify a bit is, there's nothing wrong with buying something that's going to go up in value. People buy art all the time, in part because they like it, in part because they collect it and want to make money. Just because something goes up in value doesn't mean it's a security. The SEC has issued guidance on this in their framework for investment contract analysis of digital assets. They don't specifically talk about NFTs, but the principles apply because they too are digital assets. And really, I think one of the key distinctions, and Alexandra touched on this, is it going up because there's just greater market demand for the item, or is it going up because you bought something and the person you bought it from used the money to build a platform, and that platform increased the value? So really the part of the test under Howie is the profit based on the effort of others, right? And so if the effort of others is someone building the platform, and the NFT you bought when you bought it wasn't really usable, didn't have utility, you couldn't display it or some other thing, then that might be a security. But if you can buy an asset right now, an NFT, it represents a digital asset, you can display it, and that is its intended utility, it's probably not a security. Not that it can't be, but it as a very high level generalization, that's the distinction. Even if it later goes up in value, if it was currently usable when you bought it, that is one of the key distinctions. I think you also have the other part of the Howie test is, there typically has to be some, there's an investment of money in some common enterprise. And again, if you're buying a one-off NFT, typically because there's some aspect of uniqueness, there's many situations where an NFT won't meet the commonality of interest part. So there's a number of principles in the SEC guidance that I think help many situations with NFTs. The last thing to touch on that is this, there's been a kind of a growing move towards fractionalization. So if you take a single item and you create multiple NFTs which represent a shared ownership, depending on how that's structured, that may constitute a security.
Yeah, that's a great segue, James, into our next question. I just hosted an event yesterday with actually less than 12 hours ago with a team that's fractionalizing art, and people are starting to fractionalize art and music and land. The intent there is generally to democratize the ability to purchase something that might be very expensive otherwise. For example, this one group is fractionalizing a Pablo Picasso painting, which I think everyone in the world would be honored to own a piece of a painting by someone like that in our history of art. How does that type of IP being fractionalized impact the ground rules for what's possible?
Yeah, so I think it goes back in part when you look at the Howie Test from an SEC, from a securities perspective. People who are investing money, which they're doing with fractionalization, if there's a common interest, which generally there is, where you're sharing this Pablo Picasso painting, and there's an expectation of profit, I think what it really comes down to is the profit derived from the effort of others or not. And if it is, it's probably going to be a security, because then all four factors of the Howie Test are met. And if it's not, then it may not be a security. But that's kind of the analysis you need to look at, and the particular facts and circumstances around each of the cases.
Andrew, anything to add there?
Yeah, for sure. And I think James and I kind of had a conversation about this as well, is the fractionalized ownership component of it. There's a no action letter that the SEC issued for a completely non-NFT related company called Pocketful of Quarters. And they pegged their token to a percentage of ETH and basically moved away from the ability of the common enterprise to really influence the value of whatever the asset was. And so in the fractionalized ownership context, we've seen a couple different projects that are trying to innovate and solve and mitigate their risk by pegging the fractionalized individual ownership to, say, something like ETH, which we have clarity to a certain extent from the SEC that it's not a security. And so you distance yourself away from that automatic categorization if it is pegged to something that is kind of outside the control of the company issuing the asset. Now,